Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jasmine Parmley, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Sigal Ben-Porath presenting her new book, Cancel Wars: How Universities Can Foster Free Speech, Promote Inclusion, and Renew Democracy, joined in conversation by Jane Kamensky. Thank you for joining us virtually today. This event is part of our Ethics in Your World series, presented with our co-sponsors at Harvard University's Edmond and Lilly Safra Center for Ethics, which features leading thinkers taking on tough problems that matter to us all. You can find our full event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can disable captions there as well. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Cancel Wars on harvard.com. Your purchases truly make events like today's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. Sigal Ben-Porath is professor at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is also a member of the Philosophy and the Political Science departments and a fellow at the Institute for Law and Philosophy. She has been a fellow at Princeton University's Center for Human Values, Tel Aviv University's Safra Center for Ethics, and the Edmond and Lilly Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She serves on the board of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. Joining her on our digital stage today is Jane Kamensky, Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard University and Pforzheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. She is the author of numerous books, including A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley, which won 4 major prizes and was a finalist for several others. She serves as a trustee of the Museum of the American Revolution and is one of the principal investigators on the initiative Educating for American Democracy. Today, our speakers will be discussing Sigal Ben-Porath's new book, Cancel Wars: How Universities Can Foster Free Speech, Promote Inclusion, and Renew Democracy. This is an exploration of polarized campus politics that suggests ways for schools to encourage discourse across difference. Elizabeth Anderson from the University of Michigan calls this a timely and important book that rejects the dominant framing of the controversies over free speech and provides a menu of creative alternatives that schools, colleges, and universities can use to fulfill their joint mission of supporting free speech while mitigating the harms of harmful speech. We're so pleased to be hosting this event today. The digital podium is yours, Sigal Ben-Porath and Jane Kamensky.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for this introduction and for the opportunity to discuss this book. And thank you to Jane and to all of you who are able to be with us on this very chilly day in the Northeast. I'm excited for the opportunity to discuss this new work, which I wrote during my sabbatical at the Safra Center at Harvard. So I want to start off by spending a few minutes describing the book broadly, and then I look forward to a conversation with Professor Kamensky and to questions from the audience. So over the past 7 years or so, I've been assisting colleges and universities in the United States and in a few other countries develop responses to tensions and struggles that they have faced around matters of free speech. And I help them develop policies and resolve disagreements around invited speakers, faculty speech, student organizing, and the like. In the earlier work, I framed the current struggles over free speech on college campuses as a result of the changing mission of higher education. So basically, I argued that we serve more students by number, we serve more diverse students, and we serve students who are representing more visible types of open diversity. So not only just racial and ethnic diversity, but also gender, diversity, people from diverse national origins, linguistic diversity, and increasingly, although not sufficiently, economic diversity as well. And so we are going through a generational shift in students' expectations around our responses to their identities and the kind of spaces that we create for them to develop and express them. And because the mission and the practice of higher education is changing, along with it, we are seeing changing community norms that we develop around speech and our responses to it. But in recent years, I've increasingly observed that the struggles over the boundaries of expression are not only a matter that is internal to higher education, right? So our mission or our students, but rather it seems to reflect broader democratic shifts that the US and other democracies are facing today. And basically, this book situates the fights over free speech, especially those taking place today in schools and in higher education, within the context, the broader context of democratic backsliding. So let me explain what I mean by democratic backsliding. In many countries today, researchers are documenting an escalating process of democratic erosion. And they relate it to many factors that I won't go into right now. But the one I worry about most is really polarization. And, you know, it will come as no surprise to any of you that the US is polarizing in recent years. It's not unprecedented, of course. We have historical precedents, but it's still a worrisome process. And politicians are moving to the extreme rather than the center of the ideological map. And we are seeing less and less overlap in policy preferences across parties, both among elected officials and within the population. So the population is more polarized, and there are some disagreements among researchers as to the causes and extent, but it's evident that it's happening. And the aspect of polarization that I think is most worrisome for our conversation is affective polarization, or what some scholars call ideological contempt. This is an emotional or relational aspect of polarization. Increasingly, we are seeing people who are voting differently from us or who are on the other side of the political divides, not only just as people with different views from us, but as essentially bad people. Both Democrats and Republicans see each other more and more as unintelligent, immoral, untrustworthy, as people with whom we really don't have too much in common, and as people who are acting in bad faith. And as a result, we prefer to keep a distance from them. We don't want to be their friends or neighbors. We don't want to share a dorm room with them. We don't want to listen to them. And affective polarization, therefore, destabilizes the social foundations of democracy, foundations that are necessary for us to stand on if we are to maintain our ability to operate as a self-governing society, right? If we are to be able to make decisions together that are affecting all of us, and to take everyone into account when we are making these decisions. When we don't trust each other, when we increasingly don't see each other as belonging to the same society or as deserving to belong in the same society, when we don't see people on the other side of the ideological divide as deserving members of our institutions, it's very hard to make decisions together. Moreover, we disagree with each other on our perception of reality, on what is true or false. Our sources of information are distinct, and more our understanding not only just of what the facts are, but what evidence we might need in order to prove them, right? How to prove that a certain fact is indeed a fact is part of the reality that we share, that we should take it into account, and even how to adjudicate these facts, right? Who can arbitrate what is a correct depiction of reality? And all of these are reasons for disagreement as well. And this is why colleges are caught up in this storm, because they are traditionally places or perceived as sources of reliable information. So it is easy to see how this is affecting our society, right? I mean, even if you ask a question like, who won the last election, or should I wear a mask or take the vaccine for COVID-19, it's evident that we are seeing reality differently on very important topics like these. And we have little reason to try and bridge the gaps when we think that the person on the other side, with a different set of facts at their disposal, is ignorant or ill-intentioned. And so this leads us at the personal level to be less tolerant of their views and to try to create hard boundaries for the kind of speech that we should tolerate, in our community, in our classroom, or in society more broadly. And all of this leads to less tolerance and more urgency around speech restrictions, less openness to a conversation that includes diverse views and voices. And at the interpersonal level, this looks like an atmosphere of chilled speech, demands for adherence to party line, demands to reject speakers who are expressing the transgressive opinions. And of course, at the institutional and political level, what it looks like is a proliferation of laws and regulations against books, against courses in history or gender studies, against recently the AP African American history, laws and regulations for and against accepting transgender students' pronouns and the like. So I'm not trying to suggest that these are morally equivalent, right? Our views are not morally equivalent or even epistemically equivalent, right? Equivalent in terms of the knowledge we express. When one of us is relying on the best scientific facts available and the other is doing their own research, so to speak, and rejecting any evidence that contradicts their ideology. Our views are not morally equivalent when one of us is trying to listen to more voices and the other is trying to cast some members out of the learning community or society overall. The legislative efforts and the attempts to silence speakers, professors, student protests, or to ban books, those are basically attempts to delineate new legal boundaries for speech. New boundaries for what we as a society and as institutions of learning, both at the K-12 and higher education levels, what we are allowed to think about, to speak about, to learn and to teach about. And some forces, especially at the local level, are pushing in the opposite direction and trying to be more inclusive, although sometimes in this process they are creating new orthodoxies that stand the risk to silence and censor dissenting voices. So in this book, I'm trying to put some order into this broad picture to talk about how it is affecting our democratic condition and speech protections, and how it's affecting the boundaries of what we can speak and think about in learning communities, in schools and higher education. And I suggest that this struggle is impossible to resolve democratically if we do not wrestle ourselves out of this polarized logjam. To do that, we need to rebuild a civic sphere where we can listen to as many voices as possible within boundaries that we negotiate as part of the conversation. In other words, we need to negotiate norms of speech and the boundaries of acceptable expression and responses to transgression, not simply legally, but socially and educationally. And this is the first step that will help us move beyond polarization. And in the book, I suggest various steps about how, regarding how people in different communities, students, teachers, professors, leaders, citizens, can take steps that they can take to respond to the polarizing pressures that can help us build bridges and, as I suggest in the subtitle of the book, renew democracy. And I look forward to hearing Jane's questions and comments, and of course the audiences as well afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Sigal, for that brief and tantalizing introduction to a book that is incredibly rich and also, I think, very hopeful, about the possibility of both K-12 and higher ed as solution spaces, about concrete actions that we can all be taking in our classrooms and social practices, and about the possibility for something that you mentioned in your overview of striving for expressive freedom and inclusion at the same time. And I want to have some time in our conversation and in the Q&A to press on that both and, which is one of the things that's so rich in the book. I thought we might start with a moment in your chapter on higher ed, where you write, and I'll quote you to yourself here, most students support protections for speech, aspire to greater ideological diversity, and observe that their professors do not attempt to influence their views. And yet you point out that the talking points and the debates are often driven by the asymptotes, which you estimate as 13% approximately, who seek to, quote, deplatform those that they disagree with, presumably most of that energy coming from the left, and then a similar percentage who report that they self-censor in their classroom discussions, and I'm presuming that most of that comes from the right. So this hopeful finding that there's 3/4 in the middle, right, 74% who have substantial agreement on freedom and inclusion going together, reminds me of the More in Common reports on our hidden tribes in the first instance, and then more recently about the history wars in and beyond classrooms. So we have this vernacular wisdom of the broad middle. How do we capture it on our campuses and in our schools? How do you build out from the 74% who, by your estimation, are already there?
That's a great question, Jane, and it's a really important thing to focus on right at the start, particularly because this is where the solution lies, right? This is where, you know, I don't think I'm gonna appropriate the term silent majority, but I do think that we are facing a condition where the extreme you know, positions or views or perspectives are the ones that are the loudest here. But not only that, they are also the ones who are framing the conversation for us. They are also the ones who are telling us what is at stake and telling us what everyone else should be doing. For example, you know, accepting these boundaries or promoting those boundaries of expression according to their more extreme views. And I really think, you know, one of the main perspectives that I'm trying to promote in this book and by talking about it is really to call on people who think that this is a little bit insane, and that the frame of mind and the perspectives that are offered to us in the public conversation are actually not productive, that they would be intentional in speaking about it. And I don't really mean necessarily, you know, running for office or even signing petitions. It doesn't have to be public speech. For example, when you look at the school board wars right now, which are affecting, by a report that came out last week, 50% of school district leaders in the United States. It's terrible, right? It's making it very hard for them to do their work. These fights are really organized by, you know, political ideologues and actors, and of course some public activists that are a tiny minority in most of the communities in which they operate, right? So just last week in one school district, 1,700 physical books and the entire electronic library was banned from use because of the complaint from one person, right? And so this really tells us most parents have no complaints. They don't worry about their kids accessing books, but now nobody's children can see these books, right? So what I'm trying to really make explicit in this work is that we need to be active and intentional in talking about this. What is your view? Talk to your neighbors. Come to the school board meeting. If you're a student, raise your hand in class and say, I have a question. If you're a professor, an instructor, make this possible in your pedagogical practice. Say, we're going to talk about a hard topic. If there is a perspective that wasn't voiced, whether you agree with it or not, but you think it should be a part of the conversation, I'm now making 5 minutes available to everyone to think about this and raise this. So I really think we need to create sometimes regulatory practices, as in regards to banning books, right? We need to change our regulatory practices. I think it's unconscionable that one person can make everyone's kids not be able to read a book. So some of them are regulatory, but some of them are more mundane, make space for different opinions. Make your own opinion, if it's different from the framework available, more present in the conversation.
That's really helpful. And you suggest at one point in the book the 5 minutes of space and also the practice of free writing in making that space. Can you just underline that for a second?
So, I'm trying to offer in the book a few pretty basic pedagogical practices that would allow people who are engaging in leading these conversations, so especially teachers and instructors in higher education, just be conscious of the simple tools that they have at their disposal. And I want to say there are people who are greater experts than I am in pedagogical practices and classroom discourse who are, who offer way more detailed and concrete steps that you can take. But even if you're not an expert in that, there are small things that you can do. For example, you can say, let's start class by taking 2 minutes to write a quick answer to ourselves in our own, screens or notebooks about the question that we're focusing on. Just try to gather your thoughts, right? Because it's so easy to be swayed, especially when somebody has a very strong and sometimes extreme views about a topic. It's just hard to be like, oh, okay, I probably should better just not say anything. This person will get mad, or it seems that the conversation is already going in a certain direction that I don't share. So safest to shut up, right? And so maybe if you have your 2 sentences that you took the time to write at the beginning of class, you have a framing for yourself. You can share it, even if you're not required to do that. Or maybe you can go around and say, who would like to share? Like, you may pass, but who would like to share what they wrote? Or you can, as I said, have a standing offer of 3 or 5 minutes. Throughout your class, right? So in the syllabus, you say, please note that you may claim 3 minutes of class time to raise a view that wasn't raised yet, right? And so if you feel uncomfortable from the space that or the direction the conversation is going, this is one simple thing that you are allowed to do. And, it's in the syllabus, everyone reads it. So you are able to, if they do, of course, so then you are able to make use of that as a student, as well as an instructor. And you have to be clear that it doesn't mean this is your view. It means that you think it's a view that merits attention. So these are 2 small steps for instructors to take. And again, there are more and other ones in the book and of course in the work of better pedagogues than I am.
Thanks. I implicit in the discussion already, and you mentioned it briefly in your framing remarks, is a kind of generational divide that doesn't exactly map onto our affective polarization. You point out that there's a substantial gulf between younger people and their teachers and mentors with respect to levels of social trust, and relatedly with their understandings of expressive freedom, including experience with it as a lived practice in their schools. So talk about that generational divide for a minute. I love that you always resist the sort of wagging boomers finger, which I often wind up pointing at myself, of kids these days.
Right.
Talk about the expressive divide and how, is the goal to close the gap? What can we learn from how Gen Z thinks about these issues and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jane. And it's something I have to say that this is really where my whole work on free speech some 7 years ago or a little more started, right? It's from hearing, when I was chairing the Committee on Open Expression at Penn, and a lot of my peers, my professors were saying, oh, the students have become so overly sensitive. Every little comment hurts their little feelings, they are snowflakes, they are, they make demands, they are bullies, they don't let us say anything. So some professors were very concerned about what they perceived as the students' lack of appreciation to the importance of the First Amendment or speech protections more generally. And, in a sense, it's true. A lot of these young people these days have not experienced many of the, Vietnam War protests or other, constitutive moments that for the older folks, the previous generations really organized their thinking about open expression. So they have a different view. But because I had to talk to so many students, blessedly, right, had to talk to so many students about their speech concerns, it just increasingly became clear to me that what they are saying is not, we don't care about free speech. What they are saying was way more nuanced and interesting. They were saying, look, you are telling us, you, the older generation, including and especially the left-leaning or liberal older generations, you are telling us that free speech is so important. And you are providing tools to legally, formally protect the speech for everyone. For example, through, strengthening and ensuring First Amendment protections for all. But at the same time, you are creating or allowing the conditions to be created where many people effectively cannot speak. So that is completely aligned with the legal goals of the First Amendment. Nobody is being censored. But in our classrooms, if you look around, a lot of people will never speak. And one of the reasons that they don't speak is that because they are worried about consequences, because they feel that they don't belong, because they get incessant messages that their perspective or their experience or their knowledge is not valued. And I think this is, I'll give you one just very common example that exemplifies, that shows this or illustrates this this generational divide, and that has to do with the issue of transgender students. We see some people, especially on the right, or people who are motivated by religious and other conservative and sometimes reactionary politics or values, who view the topic of transgender students as really problematic from the speech perspective, right? So, for example, we had the case in the Sixth Circuit from Shawnee State University of a professor who was refusing to use a transgender student's pronouns because of religious objection, to the notion of a person being transgender. And so here we have a big, important speech issue, right? Can you force a person to use the pronouns that, right? Can the university force the person? Can the student demand this? For the older generation, this is an interesting and important speech issue. For younger folks, including conservative folks, right? And including young people who identify as having strong religious views of various religions, this is not an issue. They don't even worry about it. They would like their transgender peers. Many of them, most of them have transgender peers and colleagues, and that's for them, it's not a topic. Of course, you use a person's pronouns. Will I call you now Rebecca? You just told me your name is Jane, right? Why would I call you Rebecca? Right? Or whichever other name, or John, right? So of course I'm listening to you and I'm following your guide about how to address you, or Professor Kamensky, right? It's up to you how to be addressed. So For young people, this is not an issue. For the older generation, it's a big issue. In this case, I do think we need to close the divide, and I think we need to close it this way, right? So I just think, you know, young folks look around them and recognize what's needed. And I think they are applying the democratic principles that were developed in prior generations more effectively, more broadly, and in a more inclusive manner. And I think that's a pretty good idea to do that, you know. I mean, so it would vary by topic, but generally speaking.
Do you have an example that cuts the other way, where you feel like the youth really need to close the gap in the direction of their elders?
Well, that's a great question. And obviously, you know, I am older, so maybe although I didn't grow up in the US, so my perspective is a little bit that of an outsider, but, you know, it might be the case that, you know, my children will inform me after this webinar that I'm a boomer myself. I think there are issues related to harm, right? Harmful speech, where younger folks have to figure out a way to address the harm that we are seeing sometimes in, you know, the common expression, or, you know, the way that people, you know, speak or make observations, that we need to figure out a way to address the perceived or experienced harm without going immediately to either censoring the speech or canceling, let's say, or rejecting the speaker, right? So I think the sensitivity to harmful speech, which is often experienced, and you know, I have to take it at face value, right? If you are telling me that I hurt your feelings, even if I didn't mean to, I have to listen to what you're telling me, right? I have to listen to the fact that you're hurt. But we need to think together about how to overcome this, rather than saying, oh, this person said something harmful or hurtful or something that felt bad for some people in the room. And so we got to fire them or get rid of them or make sure that no one ever says something like this. I think the consequence is where we need to have a conversation, because sometimes the consequence is too conclusive, in my view, to accommodate speech protections for everyone, right? And
I want to come back to this question of harm and get you to give us a little genealogy there. But first, the outsider's perspective on the US is really important. You note at several points, just briefly in the book, that there is an American exceptionalism around free expression. And I'm wondering, can I ask you to be a comparatist a little bit here and talk about what the First Amendment does that's particular for and to the United States in the context of what you call cancel wars?
Right. So, I mean, I really do think, and obviously, you know, the usual disclaimer, right? I'm not a lawyer, even though I'm operating in these circles for a while. I'm definitely not a legal expert. That's not my training. But I will say, from the perspective of the cancel wars, the First Amendment protects hate speech, right? So hate speech in the United States is actually protected under the First Amendment, and, you know, subsequent laws and interpretations. And so that really means that when people are sometimes asking me, okay, what is the boundary between hate speech and free speech, right? How do you recognize hate speech for the purpose of, you know, free speech regulation? I think it's an important question in various ways. So that's a separate issue, but, you know, it's an important question, especially for learning communities. But it's actually a very boring question from a legal perspective, because the answer is just, I don't. You know, If it's hate speech, it's still protected. And so I don't have to draw boundaries or figure out a way to identify hateful speech. Legally speaking, a person who says bigoted, racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, etc., express views of this sort, they are still protected. And for example, if you compare it to the Canadian Charter, or if you compare it to Germany or Germany, of course, with its history, other democracies in Europe, they all have actual restrictions on hate-based expression, right? So there are ways in which the law can intervene on your behalf if somebody's voicing views towards you that are, or voicing views in public that are hate-based, right, that are bigoted. And I really think this is creating, even though we're seeing many of these tensions in other democracies as well, including the ones I named, the fact that hate speech is protected is just creating more tension in our public debate. And it's really making all of, it's basically placing all of the work to address concerns about harm and about hate and about the boundaries of expression. It's placing them outside of the legal domain, right? In other words, it's not a legal question anymore. It's really a question that is relational, it's educational, it's communal, it's something that is interpersonal, it's between you and me, it's on the syllabus, right? But it's not in the law. And so I just think it creates, it pushes more of the tension downwards into our institutions, and that's where we have to address it.
Fascinating. So I want to drill down on higher ed a bit as the place where you and I and many Harvard Bookstore customers live, and a major focus of the book is what can and especially must happen in higher ed spaces as laboratories of truth. I want to start in a slightly different place, which is to ask if you think that there are parts of, this is a leading question, I admit it, if there are parts of the epistemic anarchy you describe that redound to higher ed. In other words, what's our fault? Does anti-foundationalism across many disciplines, including your own and my own, set us up for some of what we're seeing filtered down and out into politics and popular culture?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because it's a little bit hard for me to fully sort of like wrap my arms around the genealogy of these processes, especially in the US. I will say that there are, a lot of people do suggest that the pressure towards either perspectivism or relativism, or, what sometimes at least used to be called postmodernism, right? So these perspectives that are basically questioning the viability of truth claims, right? So questioning our ability to say, this is the reality, that's a final conclusive description of a scientific fact, or a prediction we're making, or the essence of human nature, or whatever is the topic, the historical narrative, right? This is the conclusive one. There is no way to criticize that. And of course, a lot of our disciplines for decades now have been involved in questioning our ability to do that, and really opening up the possibility of critical engagement with truth claims, right? With claims that are accepted, or sometimes even sort of like offhandedly assumed within our disciplinary contexts. So you could say there, you wanted that we question everything. Here, we are questioning everything, right? We're questioning the results of the elections, as I said, we're questioning the voting machines, we're questioning, whether there are chips in the vaccine, all of which I think are, unfounded as reality claims, right? As factual claims. So you could say that we are, in a way, implicated or maybe complicit in these epistemic processes as, an academic, as the academy overall. I think it's a little bit too convenient, to say that, to some extent, I think maybe a little bit complicit, yes, but I think a lot of these claims are actually the result, if not instead of, then at least in addition to that, of two other processes, which I will just name, and I think is pretty evident. One is really the fragmentation of our information sources, right? So we are just informed by different, news media, social media, or other sources. And so you can basically live your whole life within your echo chamber and never be exposed to facts that contradict your ideological perspective, right? And so that's one reason why we are in these different epistemic spaces. And the other one is really just political expediency. I mean, it's just useful for some political purposes to propagate misleading, misguided, misinformed, or disinformation sometimes, for the purpose of basically getting votes and getting people riled up, angry, and concerned, and so participating in the process on your side. So, the academy is a little bit to be blamed, but not all that much.
Fair. I wanted to ask you about some of the organizations that are doing work around expressive freedom in context of inclusive excellence, and just get a sense from you of who's doing well and right, and who's falling short, and what might be done better. So there are older organizations like Fire and Fair and the AAUP, and some newer ones like the Academic Freedom Alliance, of which I'm a member, full disclosure, or the fledgling University of Austin, which is making a brand out of this. So what are these folks getting right as advocacy organizations? Where are they falling short? How could we do better? And we have a lot of audience questions coming in, so I want to make that transition shortly.
Okay, great. So maybe I'll just respond briefly, and then we can really take some questions from the queue. I will say this. I think, first of all, I'm just very happy that there are a lot of organizations in this space. And I actually want to name a couple of other organizations. So you really described most of the spectrum of organizations that are focusing their attention on questions of academic freedom. And really, their main efforts are related to protecting instructors, professors, so the speech of people who are, standing right here and making claims. There are other organizations that are devoted either to students or really to civil dialogue. And I really think those are very important as well. So we have organizations from Braver Angels to Bridge USA to the Intercollegial Dialogue Program. So we have a lot of organizations, and that's just in the higher ed space. There are many others, and there are others too in the in the general public and also in the K-12 spaces, who focus their attention on the effort to create the not just the formal possibility to speak, but the actual possibility to speak across divides, right? And for me, this is really the most important thing. So I think, of course, it's important that we have all of these organizations. I really think, for me, the AAUP, is really historically been most material to protecting, especially professors' speech and protecting academic freedom and free expression on college campuses. And I really think that they are doing amazing work in ensuring that these concerns from students, concerns about belonging, concerns about the capacity of people with minority identities to really be able to express their views and express their experiences openly. I think they're doing an amazing job in sort of like reframing some of their forms of defense. I think the ACLU is doing similar work, including in the academic sphere, that is very important. And some of their, some of their members are doing excellent work in training. I'm gonna give a shout out to my friend and colleague Emerson Sykes, who is training student activists in fighting against injustice as they see it while protecting open expression for all. So really wonderful work with these organizations. And then, some of them are either newer, like the AFA that you mentioned, and they are more niche, focusing on professors. I think, most of the statements that they make, I think, are valid and useful. FIRE, I've had some disagreements with them in the past. They really align themselves right now broadly with free speech, not just in education. They've expanded their mission in the past year. And, they have historically been perceived as more right-wing, although they are fighting against this view and representing a more ecumenical perspective, for example, by working against some of the recent speech restrictions in Florida. But I really think the more the merrier. I'm just excited that this is a civic space that is lively, that is inviting people to participate, that is calling people, not just to hear what they say, but also to be a part of their membership and influence their directions. So yeah, any and all.
Great. So I'm going to turn to some audience questions now and try to group areas of interest and discussion. And one that flows through several questions is about the particularities of K-12 versus higher ed, and also public and private universities. Are there, so you're not recommending in any way one size fits all solutions. If you could talk a little bit about what you see as most fertile at K-12 with the particular challenges of the current moment there, and then different kinds of colleges and universities.
Right. So in K-12, as I mentioned briefly, my biggest concerns is about public pressures, particularly coming from conservative and extreme right activists that are disrupting the normal practices of schools. They tend to be a small minority, although not in every district, of course. And really what they train a lot of their attention on right now is two things. Broadly speaking, one is they are looking to get a lot of the people who are responsible administratively for inclusion or belonging or diversity or cultural competence. They're looking to get them fired. A lot of these people are leaders in their districts who were hired after 2020, after George Floyd. And so there is a targeted effort to fire people who are responsible for ensuring that especially African-American, but generally diverse students are included in conversations, in the curriculum, etc. And they're trying, and just yesterday, my own school district, along with numerous school districts across the country, were sued by some conservative activists for having student affinity groups for African-American students, saying that this goes against equal protection, which of course I think is ridiculous, but it tells you something that they didn't sue the district for having a Jewish group or a French-speaking group. They sued the district for having an African-American group, right? And so I really worry that a lot of these efforts in K-12 settings are focused on racial equality and trying to undermine any efforts that are being done in this domain. nominally in order to ensure fairness and equity for white students. So that's sort of like the language that's being spoken. So this is a real concern to me, this and the book banning, of course. And I think leaders now have to recognize that there is no way to duck for cover. They have to take this on, and they need to call on their constituents, on this, the parents who are their allies and often think everything is fine and are not speaking out, to really participate in them in an effort to reclaim their professional capacity to do their work. So this is really just about public schools, which are really serving still close to 90% of American students, and it's very important to protect them as citizens and as practitioners. In terms of the higher ed space, I will just say, of course, there's a clear difference, which is becoming even more evident in the public sphere now between public and private universities and colleges. The public ones are just more, first of all, what they do is government action, right? So they are more clearly bound by the First Amendment, although private institutions tend to just align with them and remain committed to the same values. Public universities right now in some states are under assault in terms of the kind of content that they are allowed to teach. And so we are seeing governors in some states that are really trying to influence what public universities in their states are able to teach, and particularly, as we know, restricting teaching about and sometimes by African-American histories and historians, sometimes about gender studies or any issues related to gender, and to operate any function that is related to creating a space that is inclusive and allows the belonging of all of your students. And in my view, private universities are still more protected in this regard because of these differences, and they have to come to the support publicly of private institutions that are really experiencing a significant loss of their academic freedom and ability to operate autonomously as institutions.
So there's a number of questions about limit cases in one way or another. I'll reductively characterize them as, but what about Nazis, right? Like where are the places where there are bright lines around the discussable? And these are earnest questions from serious people. I'll quote one. I find it difficult to relate to people as neighbors if they put my marriage in scare quotes. You speak in the book about closed and open questions and the ways in which that distinction might play out in expressive controversies on campus. Are there places where you draw lines? How do we think about that when we're considering both the expressive freedom of campus stakeholders and the dignitary interests of other campus stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this question, Jane, and the people in the audience raising it. I want to make a distinction between private relationship and institutional structures, right? Including small ones like classrooms or college, opportunities and practices and structures. Of course, if my neighbor disapproves of my marriage or disapproves of my religion or has views that I find to be abhorrent, and also maybe create for me a sense of that I'm not safe around them. Obviously, don't knock on their door and ask for a cup of sugar, is probably just not going to feel great. And why would you do that? So I'm not saying that you have to do that necessarily with everyone, right? I think it's good to try to do it as best you can, but if you're not safe, or if you really feel strongly that this person doesn't accept your existence as an equal neighbor, an equal person in society, obviously, it's not your responsibility to fix that. I do think that in institutional settings, and particularly in learning communities, right? So in colleges and in a different way in K-12 settings, we have to figure out ways to listen to voices in, both about open questions, so issues about which we really still need to learn a lot more before we are able to make up our collective minds, and also about closed questions to the extent that we can learn something about this. So it really depends on what for. Like, as you said, the Nazi question, right? So people who are morally abhorrent, or people who have beliefs that have clearly been just rejected and refuted, for decades, and there's no point in debating them again. I actually supported at my university the invitation of speakers who have concerns or disagreements about vaccines, right? And the reason that I thought it was important for our students, including our students in our public health program, to hear about that is that this is their audience. This is the material that they have to learn to address. If the first time that they heard an anti-vaccine argument is in the field when they are already professionals, I failed them as a teacher, right? I mean, that's not where I teach, but, generally speaking, it's important for people to understand the society in which they live. And we can do that while maintaining our epistemic boundaries, right? So as a teacher, I can say, look, of course, we know vaccines save lives, right? Here is the information that we learned about this. Here is, here are the graphs. Here is childhood illnesses. Here is COVID, etc. Now, as you know, a lot of people have concerns. Some have concerns because of historical injustices that were done to their communities, like African-American people in this country, in terms of their relationship with the medical establishment. And some have concerns because they are getting their information from ridiculous sources, from unfounded claims. Let's talk about that. Let's hear from them. Let's figure out a way to address these concerns and to incorporate them into our practice. And so I think the boundaries can be maintained by expressing our norms epistemically, or inclusive norms, and then figuring out, sometimes you read or listen to materials that, are actually, you learn about Nazi. Can you teach about German or Nazi history? Do you have to read primary sources for that? I think it makes sense to do that, right? So the question is, what for? It's not for advocating. It's not for the Nazi person to come and persuade you that they are right, but it's actually for the epistemic, the learning opportunity that we get from being exposed to these opinions. So we have to be clear about the reason.
That's there are in the book a number of great sort of pedagogical moves, and that what for question is one that I'll take away. We have just under a minute left, and I want to ask you to close by talking a little bit about language. So you point out that cancel wars are language wars, and that the names that we call these controversies themselves have an impact. So what should we say instead of canceled, and maybe instead of safe or harmed or civil? Do you have a sort of quick lightning round takeaway for reframing these controversies by reshaping our own language as instructors?
So the cancel wars, I think, are a cultural phenomenon right now. So we can talk about them, but I think that the questions that we need to ask ourselves is the question of what are the norms that are fitting within our community, right? So they have to be smaller questions. The question that we ask is not what may we never talk about or what should you never say, although there are things that you should never say, right? I think that is acceptable to decide, look, in this classroom, we don't talk like that. We don't curse. I mean, you can make decisions about boundaries of language within your particular context, but then you have to be intentional in framing with your community, with your students, with other people participating. What are the norms that are effective for us? And can we revisit them? Can we rethink? Can we now talk about another topic now that we have trust? The main goal is to build these norms in a way that increases trust and therefore allows us to say more. And I think this is where we end, right? We are out of time. I really want to thank you, Jane, for this really lovely conversation, and to thank the audience for their participation. I think maybe Jasmine has closing words as well.
Yeah, just a couple of things. Thank you so much for being here with us. This was such a thought-provoking discussion, and I think we all have a lot to ruminate on over the weekend. Thank you everyone at home for joining us today. Please stay warm this weekend. If you haven't picked up a copy of Cancel Wars yet, you can from Harvard Bookstore, both either in store or online. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.